Thank you, Jasper, and good evening, everybody. Yeah, it's a privilege to have these talks, and I'm very honored of everybody taking the time to join us for this talks. So let's fall into this whole topic of fear. And I just want to put this disclaimer forward. Apparently, I didn't do it with my previous talks. So yes, like Jasper said, this is not intended to be a medical talk or giving medical advice. You still need to see your doctor for an examination and to make a proper diagnosis. But what we'd like to do is to focus on biblical foundations of diseases, and especially how negative emotions can trigger our physiology to manifest with diseases. And then also, like I said in the past talks, that we use a biopsychosocial model. And just as of late, this last week, I actually attended a talk where a colleague said we should rather use a biopsychosocial spiritual model for disease, because that's the missing link in most of our approaches to these diseases. And then also, if we talk about the medical part of it, the biomedical model, that we actually are dealing with our neuropsychoimmunology, our nervous system, our thoughts and emotions have an effect on our immunology. So let's fall in and see what fear is. And just as of short a definition, the emotions of being afraid or feeling danger or that evil is near, an uneasy or anxious thought. And I want to emphasize the word here that it's an emotion, which triggers a lot of things. The fear, the feeling of danger, evil, uneasiness, and how it actually affects our thought process. And we all know this definition that fear actually stands for false evidence appear real. So by implication, we are busy dealing with a lie here. So what is fear? Let's try and raffle it out a bit. Fear is our enemy for the simple reason it comes to kill, steal, and destroy. I think this is no secret that it attempts to control us and to steal our faith and destroy our happiness. And on this note, you can actually already see that fear has got no hold on you unless you allow it, unless you give it authority to steal your faith and destroy your happiness. Fear causes us to unbelief and doubt. And a lot of the time, if we get this in this situation, it paralyzes us that we can't think clearly, can't make proper decisions or act accordingly to what is appropriate. Fear causes us to live a life of lies, perceptions, and then obviously the maybes or what ifs. It projects something into the future which might never be or might never happen. And yet we start living that uncertainties like as if it is certainties. So just think for a while on this, how we live lies, perceptions, and the maybes and what ifs, and how it affects our daily life. We actually deal with it just about every minute of our life. Fear is a sin, and basically the reason why we can say that is it separates us from God's truth or truths, and it destroys our belief system. And I would even go as far as saying that fear is a form of occultism, because the occult is basically to go into rebellion with God's word. And by a lack of a better word, a lack of faith that we can trust that God's word is true, that what he says is true, that we can believe it and stand on it. Right, so what does fear do to the body and how does it work? Now, if you think by implication, fear is actually there to warn us of potential danger so that we can take precautions to protect ourselves. And I think that's a good thing, or it should be a good thing. But why do fear then have a negative connotation to it? So fear will always trigger the fight and flight response, and we'll have a look at that a bit later. And literally what it does is the adrenal glands produces excessive amount of adrenaline and cortisol. And if that is done over an excessive or over a period of time, excessively, it will destroy our immune system and our calcium metabolism in our bones. I think you might have seen this or heard this before, the HPA axis. Everything that we see, hear, touch, feel, our interactions or signals that we get from our environment goes through our hypothalamus. It's a part of structure in the brain. And whenever we experience something as danger or it triggers the fight and flight response, the pituitary gland is the conductor of the endocrine system in our body. And that starts by producing different hormones, will trigger our different organs to produce certain reactions or hormones. And for instance, when it comes to the fight and flight response, our adrenal glands are primarily there to produce adrenaline and cortisol. Now, just to look at the physical effect of this, it will increase your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiratory rate, your blood sugar, sweat, your muscle tone, and cholesterol. And you can think for yourself, if you have this chronically over a period of time, that you will manifest with some form of symptoms or diseases, ischemic heart diseases, lung diseases, diabetes, muscle tone or increased muscle tone over a long period of time will present with some form of muscular dysfunction or inflammation. And cholesterol, my big pep talk, is the plasters of the arterial systems or the plasters of our cell membrane. So it will increase, obviously, if it thinks that there's a problem and it needs to fix it. On the other hand, our immune system will be depleted, our sexual function will go down, and our gastrointestinal tract function will go down. Just think for a while, if somebody stands with a revolver against your head, your immune system, your fight and flight kicks in. The last thing your immune system wants to do is to fight off a viral infection or that you would like to reproduce at that moment in time, or that you want to go to the toilet to defecate. So actually all those processes literally comes to a standstill in an acute fight and flight situation. But over a period of time, if it's a long period sustained, you will also see that these systems will start malfunctioning and present with diseases. Right, let's go back to the biblical meaning of fear. Now, this is an interesting topic. The Hebrew word for fear, there's two words in the Strong Dictionary, yir'ah, and that basically references to God, the fear that we have for God or the respect that we have for God, and then yareh, to be frightened or to be afraid or dreaded. Now, you can see that the one is, as far as I'm concerned, the good fear effect that we have, the fear for God and his laws, and then the yareh, which is the negative one that will put us in fight and flight. And hopefully we will talk about this later if we start looking at diseases, how these two concepts or words actually determines our value system. So if we get back to what fear actually implicates, it implicates a lack of faith or faithlessness, a form of sin or rebellion, or then even if you put the rebellion against God, you can even call it occult or occultic or a form of occultism. Fear focus also only on the temporal events, and it ignores the eternal events and plays off a central role in our daily earthly existence. And like I said, basically, there's not a minute of the day where we don't have to fear certain what ifs and maybes and uncertainties. And depending on how we react to these responses, will trigger a fear response or a fight and flight response, or the opposite of a rest and digest, where we can actually recuperate and heal ourselves. So fear creates a war within us because it's always this constant believing God's truth or accepting the false evidence that appear real. And here we have to make a choice every time of obeying God and to resist the devil, to make certain choices of the value systems that we believe and the values that we adhere to. But this brings a whole topic of its own. How can you have a value system if you don't know about the alternatives? How can you make choices if you don't have the ability to make a choice? And how can we obey God and resist the devil if we don't know the strategies of God, his principles, and the strategy of the enemy? So if we bring this back to the medical science, you can understand there's a big gap. My people perish because of a lack of knowledge. We don't know the biblical truths about how fear affects our physiology, and that there is even a direct correlation between the negative emotion of fear and our physiology. So we can make the assumption that fear becomes a spiritual issue. And like I said right in the beginning, if we don't address this on a spiritual level, it's very difficult to treat fears or to treat the diseases associated with fear. So how does fear enter our lives? And this is sometimes a question that we don't often think about or ask. But whatever we see and hear will influence our minds, our thoughts, our emotions, and our subconscious. Now, our subconscious is actually where our DNA of our computer's hard drive is. That's where the programming takes place. And that's our default system, if I may call it that. So all the input that goes into our brain comes via what we see or hear, and our interactions with our environments that will have the influence of our mind, thought, emotions, and our will, or for that matter, our soul. Right. We choose what we watch and we participate in these activities, and I'm just going to name a few here. It might sound a bit judgmental, but the things that we watch on TV, the type of movies that we watch, the horror stories, video games, the Harry Potter phenomena, witchcraft, Wicca, black magic, and the occult. This is all stuff that influence our belief systems. And the problem here is we tend to believe that this is real. Even though it's fiction, we start acting it. Our social media is just another example of this, how it influences our children, for instance. And because we can't protect children normally from what they see or do on a cell phone, we expose them. We actually open the gates here for these negative emotions of fear, bitterness, rejection, envy, and so forth. Fear manifests mostly through anxiety and some form of stress symptoms and mental health. The primarily focus of or causes of mental health has a lot to do with this fear or negative emotion of fear. And hopefully we will look at that also a bit later. And this opened the doors for other negative emotions, the fear of rejection, fear of bitterness, fear of lovelessness, fear of jealousy and envy, and I can go on. There are zillions of different fears. Right, I'm not going to focus on this, but just to mention the manifestations of fear in diseases that we see. Fear has a primarily function or manifestation in with our respiratory system, our lungs. And for that matter, asthma is probably the one that I like to use as an example. Fear will squeeze all the air out of you. It will prevent you from breathing. And the moment you stop breathing, you're dead. So you can think about the effects of the physiology on our body and how, if it affects our lungs or respiratory system, how it can defect or manifest in diseases. Allergies, other cause. In one of my previous talks, I mentioned the over and underactive immune system. And again, here is allergies is mostly an overreaction of our immune system. And if it's to a skin allergy or something that we eat or medication, it's an overreactive or a reaction of our immune system that gets triggered. Can manifest in cancers, environmental illnesses, mental health. And what we sometimes don't even make the connection is that this negative emotions of shame, unworthiness, guilt, feelings of condemnation or self-condemnations are actually directly correlated or connected to a spirit of fear. And yeah, it's an amazing thing once we start digging into the roots of diseases and talking about these shame, fear, and guilt and condemnation and so on, how it will directly relate to diseases. I want to place the fears in 4 categories. Like I said, there's a lot of different fears, but basically the 4 categories or the legs of the table is fear for man or of man, fear of rejection, fear of failure, and then fear of abandonment. So let's jump in and see how these things look on their own. Fear of man, if we look at Psalm 118, verse 8, it says, it's better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. Now, by implication, there must be a higher power involved in this thing of fear. If we don't have a higher power, we will always have to find our solutions in man, and man will disappoint us. No matter who it is, your biggest ally, like your biggest enemy, will disappoint you sooner or later. So man is not a reliable thing. But we also need to understand that Ephesians 6 says that our enemy is not flesh and blood. So it's not man per se. It's the spiritual aspects of what is going on in man. It's against the principalities, against the powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And therefore, our fear of man is unfounded. We have an ability to take authority over if a person is a threat to us. We can allow it if a bully can knock my mind or control my fears, the way I think, the way my emotions play up to me. Or, yeah, it's like I say, we have a choice if we're going to allow this negative emotion to take control of us and steal our joy. So the spirit of fear is never from God. It's something that the evil one comes to kill, steal, and destroy, or to try and kill, steal, and destroy us, and try and separate us from the truths of God. So the second one, the fear of rejection, it's a very interesting topic where rejection will always ask questions. Do I belong here? Where does my strength come from? Who am I, or what am I? What is my identity? It always tries to either cause conflict or self-doubt. And if we ask these questions and we can't answer it with certainty, the moment we start to doubt, that's when the doors open and we open ourselves for the manifestation of evil. We can just go back to the first story in the Bible, Adam and Eve. What did Satan try and do? He just made them a little bit doubt of what they believed, and the doors was open and he could come in and kill, steal, and destroy. Most of this fear of rejection happens in the absence of a secure environment of love. So you can always go and see if you spot or identify a rejection, you can always be sure that there will be some form of verbal or emotional or physical or sexual abuse in the past as a child or in adulthood, wherever. But unless we deal with these abuse situations, it becomes very difficult to cure the spirit of rejection or the fear of rejection. Then the fear of failing, as Proverbs says that for a just man, or some of the translations say a righteous man, falls 7 times and rises up, but the wicked shall fall into mischief. Now, I think this says it all, that fear will drive us not to stand up, and it will make us make choices that will lead us into mischief. And if we don't make provision for failure, we're bound to, we will be bound with a fear of failure. So again, if we renew our minds, if we start thinking differently about failure are actually opportunities to learn and grow. And if we have this attitude of we never fail, we either win or we learn, we will handle life a lot differently. Just an example, what do we normally teach our kids? The primary thing is we tell them not to make mistakes. And yet, how do they learn? Is actually by making mistakes. We try and protect them or overprotect them from not getting hurt. But believe me, unless you didn't learn the lesson through that painful experience of hurt, you will not understand the essence of what it is to make a failure and why you shouldn't make a plan to fail. So, yeah, this is, again, a topic on its own, but let's focus on this one. Let's make provision for failure in our lives, because that's how we will free ourselves of the spirit of failure. And then avoidance arises out of fear. And we all know the manifestations of phobias, or the fear of needles, or fear of water, or fear of heights. And it's because we never address the fear, the primary cause of this fear. We try and run away, we try and avoid situations that will bring us in this phobias, or situations where we will experience these phobias. And again, a phobia is just a false reality that we believe. And then lastly, denial is an act of fear. Again, like avoidance, we deny the reality. And unless we face the reality, we will never be able to deal with this fear. But this is also how fear can manifest. A lot of time we tend to think that we identify that people are in denial, but we don't connect the dots that they are actually dealing with a fear of failure or rejection or abandonment. So the cause of failure is sin. It's because we accept or tend to believe the false truths, or not to adhere to God's teachings or truths. Right, and then the last one, the fear of abandonment. This is also a topic that we can talk about the whole day, but basically this can enter or the spirit of fear of abandonment can enter our lives as even as early as our time in the womb. It's mostly in children conceived out of or born out of wedlock, or from divorced parents, where there was arguing and strife in the home, or even the death of a loved one, a parent or a granny or so, which opens the doors for these spirits to come in. And it's basically where there's an absence of love. Right. So I actually thought that to make this more practical is to just take one example of women were created to be a helper or a follower. And if the man fails to lead, protect, or provide in her security, physically or emotionally or spiritually, then the fear of abandonment will manifest. And we see this a lot in mental health. There's a huge discrepancy between mental health in males and females. And where you see it predominantly in females, you can 9 out of 10 times go and look and identify this, the cause of it, as where an absent father figure or a male figure that didn't play the protective role or providing the security. And that's when these symptoms of psychiatric disorders or mental disorders will manifest. Insomnia, panic attacks, even a thing like drivenness. We sometimes look at drivenness as a positive, but if drivenness is done for the wrong reasons, that's when the disease will manifest, and especially things like cancer, blood pressure, the stress response. Right, so let's try and close this talk and see what's the remedies for fear. And unfortunately, there is no quick fix. There is no easy way out here. You have to face your fears. You will have to get in that aeroplane, put on a parachute, and jump out of the aeroplane to conquer your fears. You will have to go and hold that snake or spider that's causing the fear or stress response in your body. And yeah, there's always the limits to what is possible and why we should do it. But the reality is, if you want to come free of this negative emotion of fear, you will have to confront it eye to eye, face to face. Right. So the secret here is the battlefield is the mind. As a man thinketh, so is he. So a lot of what we believe is false reality. And we need to go and change or renew our minds to be transformed so that we can come free of this. We need to identify the fear and address each fear on the biopsychosocial spiritual level. And unfortunately, doing this, we probably will need the help of a professional, either a counselor, a psychologist or psychiatrist, or somebody who's well trained in these diseases or in mental health. And then from a spiritual perspective, we actually have an easy way. Easier said than done, though, but to repent and to renew our mind. If we can work it out for ourselves, what is fear versus the answer, what is faith? Because the opposite of fear, the treatment of fear, is faith. Do we believe that what God said, that he will do it, and that it will come to fruition, that we can stand on his word, on his promises, that he is our provider, that he is our healer, that he is our protector? Or do we have to put our faith in man and what we can do? And like everything in medicine, it's a process of developing new thoughts, strengthening emotions, and emotional muscles. And in medicine, we've got two disciplines at the moment, which excites me very much, which does not involve medicine or chemicals. Neuroplasticity and mindfulness, or in the olden days, we used to talk about hypnosis or meditation. But basically what mindfulness is to focus on the here and now and to reprogram yourself not to believe the lies, but to reinforce the truths in ourselves. And I'll show a little video clip quickly on neuroplasticity and how it works.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well travelled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep travelling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
Right, so very interesting that the Bible actually talks about this in Romans 12, was 1 and 2, where it says, do not conform to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of our minds. So I'm very excited about this discipline because it's something that's available to all of us for free. It takes a bit of practice, but remember, we are creatures of habit. And as long as we're in a comfort zone and have it as a habit, we can't make changes. I'm just going to end off just mentioning that we've had 4 groups or categories now, but there are pages and pages of things that we can connect to fear of heights and water, or fear of pregnancy, or a fear of vomiting, or darkness, or a fear of dreams, weapons, the unknown, punishment, suffering, death, animals, fear of the future, or war or conflict, or inferiority or horror. We can go on and on and on with these lists. But remember, they all have basically the same primary principles: fear of man, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of abandonment. Right, and the treatment for them is all the same. So in conclusion, let's end this talk with: fear is a mental or emotional challenge. It's not physical. It manifests with physical symptoms, but it is a way we think, or a belief system that is crooked or skewed. And where did we open the doors for these belief systems? The good news is fear is hardly ever real. We can overthink these processes. You know, if I jump out of an airplane with a parachute, I might die. The chances of this, the ratio of it happening, is very, very, very small. But because we focus on the 0.0000001%, it becomes our reality. The moment we change it and say, this will not happen to me, it's highly unlikely. I mean, you can have the same thing with getting in your car and have an accident and die. The way we retrain our brain or practice the neuroplasticity, these symptoms disappear. And it is amazingly how fast it can disappear. Fear comes from a place of insecurity, a lack of faith, or believing a lie. And again, if we can understand the principles behind fear, we can address it. We can do something about these insecurities. We can make changes for the lack of in our faith, and change the way we think, or the lies that we believe. How can we expel these lies from our lives? Medication will never, ever address the cause, but it might be needed as a crutch to support you while you're addressing this process of changing or making changes in your mindset. And then, the good news is there is practices, alternatives that we can use these days, like neuroplasticity and mindfulness, to conquer our fears and diseases that are triggered by fears. But I also want to bring in the spiritual component here. We need a spiritual revelation. I can tell you all these things, but unless you give yourself to experience or make these changes, life will just continue the way it is. We know the old saying, if you keep doing what you're doing, the outcome will always be the same. Just lastly, these two verses have made a big impression on me in dealing with these negative emotions. The NIV talks about, for the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid or give us fear, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. Now, this is something that we will talk a lot about in healing or spiritual healing, is self-discipline. We can give you all the info, but at the end of the day, you need to put your finger on your own chest and say, it starts with me. I need to make these changes. I need to implement it. And do I do it in my own strength? Probably not. We need help, but we need the help of our maker, a higher power. Okay. The King James Version says, God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. We need to get that sound mind. What is truth? What is false? What is a lie? What is the maybes? What is the but if? Ifs that we believe every day or live every day. And then 1 John 4 verse 8 says, there is no fear in love. We spoke a lot about the circumstances or an absence of love, which will open the doors for these spirit of fears. So there is no fear in love. There's the medication that you need. If you have a spirit of fear, we've got to get the love story right. And that is also a talk that we can talk for a whole night on. But perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. There's some of the versions that says, those who fear expects pain. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. So go and think about it. Whenever we fear, we actually expect pain. We expect punishment. Now, who wants to live in fear for punishment if we can actually reign over it and protect ourselves from punishment or getting hurt just by this concept of love? So that's my talk for the evening. Thank you, Jasper.